Welcome back to Eigen Designs. I went out and bought a OneFinity CNC machine, which I'm really excited about, but it doesn't come in until June. So put my hopes and dreams aside for a second. I'm going to be focusing on building the base table that'll support my CNC. I do have an enclosure design, but that's still a work in progress, and that's a subject for a future video. Instead, today I'll be taking this wood, doing a whole bunch of cutting, and making the table that'll eventually support the CNC whenever it arrives. This will be part one of a two-part series, so stick around and let's get after it. Before I get into the cutting and the design of this particular CNC bench, I thought it would be helpful to spend some time talking about how the garage is going to be laid out. So I, like a lot of woodworkers, use my garage as my woodworking space, and so it still has to serve as a garage. It's got to fit my truck, it's got to fit all the tools that I have. So as I collect more tools, I want to be intentional and effective with how I use the space. So what you see laid out here is the shop as it is today with a few additional features. So you'll notice a saw stop table, which I don't currently have. I've set the target that if I ever get to 1,000 subscribers, and I'll go out and buy myself a saw stop. You see a pretty big 8-inch joiner in the back. I don't have one of those at the moment. But what I'm doing is making some preparations in my shop so that the future state, if and when I ever acquire these pieces of equipment, will be able to fit, and then the layout and the design will be conducive to highly productive projects that I like to work on. So what you see here laid out is the future vision for my shop as my channel continues to grow and as I continue to invest more time in woodworking and collect more tools. This is how I want everything laid out to do the projects that I like to do more effectively. So with that as the scene set, let's get into the actual construction. Today I'm going to be building the base for my CNC enclosure. So a couple of weeks ago I decided to pull the trigger and order my OneFinity CNC. Did a lot of research. It seemed to be the best one for the money that's out there. But unfortunately it doesn't come in for another 3 months. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I've got some lumber that I'm gonna use to frame up the base. Very similar to how I did the workbench that you see here. I've been really happy with it in terms of stability and functionality. Having this rectangular cavity underneath allows for quite a bit of add-ons once you know what you need for the project that you're working on. You can build out more shelving, you can put out more drawers. So I want to do the same approach with the base, and I've been playing around with a few designs in SketchUp. And so today I've landed on a design. I've got a cut list, a very hastily drawn cut list that I'm going to start working on to build the base. And part of this is going to be shuffling around some things in the shop. So I'm going to be taking my dust collection system and putting it in the corner. That's going to free up this area over here if I want to put something larger, like a large jointer. I'm looking at an 8-inch right now, but haven't purchased anything. And eventually, I've told myself that once I reach 1,000 subscribers, I am going to buy a saw stop and replace this DeWalt job site table saw that has served me so well. But I'm waiting until I get to a sizable subscriber count before I pull the trigger on that. So a lot of things in the works, but today's project is going to be focused on building the base for the CNC. So let's get after it. Rex likes to take my scraps and chew on it. Those little chew toys, Rex? He loves it when Daddy goes woodworking. I'm gonna chew it up. Just got done with the cut list. So I've got 4 of the 30-inch tall legs. I've got 4 of the 27-inch bracers, 4 of the 38-inch bracers, and one of these has to have some dados cut into it. And then I've got these, what I'm calling the ledge supports over here. These are going to overhang to support the cantilevered portion of the MDF board for the OneFinity. I've got 2 of those, and both of those need dado cuts in them as well. So I'm probably going to do that as I'm putting everything together. I think I might get both sides of the frame put up together, and then I'll worry about the dados. I decided to use my workbench as the place of assembly because I know it's level and I know that it's flat, much more so than my garage floor. I'm also using one of my larger bar clamps to keep everything in alignment as I am doing my pre-drills and putting in the 6-inch lag bolts. As I was making the workbench, which I am currently assembling everything on, it was made out of very similar construction, and I realized that this helps keep everything in alignment as you're assembling things together, because if you don't have anything putting pressure on those joints, you can have the wood kind of turn on you and it comes out of alignment ever so slightly, and then it just doesn't look as good. So this was just a lesson that I learned putting together the workbench. You see me here using an extra 4x4 below as a spacer because I want the bottom cross members to be about 4 inches off the ground. So there's one side done. I complete a similar process to do the other leg piece off camera, but I didn't want to go through this twice in the interest of time. Before assembling the 2 leg pieces together, I decided to cut the dados in the cross member that's going to eventually house the 2 ledge pieces that support the cantilevered overhang section of the workbench. So I initially started with using exact dimensions to frame up how big of an opening to cut, and then I decided it was probably a better idea to use the actual pieces themselves since that would be more representative. And I also decided to use a piece of scrap wood to get the exact depth of cut because the 2 pieces that meet have to be exactly halfway in order for everything to sit flush once everything is done. So rather than measuring it, I decided to use a piece of scrap wood that was going to get thrown away anyway and make sure I had everything exactly at the right height to have things sit flush once everything was assembled. I ended up having to make a minor adjustment prior to the final cuts. With the blade height set, it was then just a matter of running the saw blade through enough times to create the opening size that I was looking for, which is going to be the exact diameter of the cross member that's going to go through it, which is about 3.5 inches. I could have swapped out my saw blade for my dado stack, but to be honest, I found this to be a lot quicker. If I was doing a lot of dados, then I would actually swap out for the dado stack itself, but this process went by pretty quickly and was probably faster than switching out the blades. So I just decided to do it this way. With the dados cut, I then went back to my workbench and turned the table upside down in preparation for assembly. By assembling it upside down, I'm able to ensure that the top of the work surface is going to be flush. And given that this is going to support a CNC, I want to make sure the top surface is as flat as possible. I tried to use my bar clamps to help keep alignment while I was screwing these pieces together, but unfortunately they weren't long enough. So I had to make do with just hand power. A trick you can use whenever you're trying to do something like this with one person, trying to run some cross beams with a single person, you can take just a normal clamp with a straight piece of wood underneath, and then use that to just rest the beam on top. It does a couple of things. It holds it up for you at the right elevation, and it also gets it completely even with the other side as well, hands free, so you're able to do this without the assistance of another person. So this is most of the wooden frame assembled. I still have 2 ledge pieces to install that are going to go in those dados right here, those little notches, but that's where it's going to go. I cut out some notches in those support ledges off camera in a very similar way to how I did the initial cross beams. I didn't decide to put that footage in this particular video. But you see me here with the rubber mallet just getting everything aligned to have a nice flush feel, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Both pieces fit really well in their designated notches and gives the CNC table kind of an interesting look, because otherwise this would be a pretty boring structure. But what I've done is I've intentionally left space in between those 2 support ledges so that I can add a future drawer if needed. And on the left-hand side, the side closest to the camera, there's going to be space for the power unit to go whenever the CNC is actually installed. So there's some functionality built in, but overall I'm really happy with how this is looking. I've got the table pulled out of the wall for a second, just to show you some of the features I've put in on the underside of the table. So I've got this power strip right here that's surge protected, just to protect the electronics. And I've taken a router and kind of made a channel right here so that once the tabletop goes on, we've got good cable management that goes underneath the table. And then before I push this against the wall, I just wanted to show that this cable is routed along the back side of the table so that it's nice and tucked away and tidy before I put the heavy table on. Here is the 1-inch 5-foot by 5-foot section of plywood that I got for the tabletop for the CNC. I actually could not find MDF in a big enough size. Most places sell sheet goods 4-foot by 8-foot, and my tabletop is 52 inches by 53 inches. So I had to get this from a specialty store somewhere in town. I was actually able to get it half off because it's got a pretty significant damage portion right here, but that actually doesn't matter for me because I'm cutting it 52 inches long this way, which ends right here. So the damage section isn't going to give me any troubles, and I got it half off. So that's great. I'm going to use this straight edge right here to run my circular saw across, put a nice clean edge on it. I'll do the same thing on the other side, and then once it's cut, I will be putting it on the stand and securing it with some L brackets. Here's what it looked like once I put the tabletop on top of the base. And even though I modeled this in SketchUp to scale and I knew how everything was going to fit inside of the room, it still was larger than what I was expecting, which just speaks to how large the OneFinity CNC machine really is. If you look closely, you can see a notch cut out on the left-hand side of that crossbeam, which is where some of the cables are going to be fed through to the control unit that's eventually going to be mounted on the other side. The one thing I'm going to do just to kind of clean this up a little bit and make it look a little bit less industrial is put some edge banding on the side of this table. But otherwise, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and I'm just ready for my CNC to arrive. To clean up these edges, I'm going to be applying some birch edge banding that's got some adhesive on the back. And the way that this edge banding works, you just apply some heat and it melts the adhesive on the back of the edge banding. And then once it cools, you can come back later and clean up the edges so your piece of plywood looks more like one continuous piece of solid wood. It's pretty cool the way it works. You see me here using a specialty tool specifically made for applying edge banding. My wife continues to tell me that there's other applications for this particular heat device, but I haven't quite figured that one out yet. To apply the edge banding, I'm starting at one end and slowly making my way down towards the other end. That way you don't have any folds or wrinkles in your edge banding once everything is complete. Once the adhesive dries, you cut off the excess at the end. I found scissors work just fine, but you can use some flush trim pliers if you've got those. And then you remove the excess hanging above and below the table. You see me here using a specialty tool that's got a blade that flushes up the edge banding with the existing tabletop. It works pretty well. It's not perfect, but I was pretty happy with the results, and it just basically shaves off both sides at the same time, almost like a block plane on both sides of the table. Once the excess is removed, the last step is just to come through with some fine grit sandpaper and just round over any edges and any kind of rough burrs that have been left behind by that cutting tool, and the end product looks really good. So you can see here a pretty significant enhancement over the previous look because it feels more like a solid piece of wood as opposed to a sheet of plywood. Not nearly as industrial looking, and certainly something that looks more elegant than it otherwise would. And that's going to conclude part 1. I can't really take this build any further until I get the OneFinity CNC. I'm going to wait until I have everything installed and working before I build the enclosure around it. So part 2 likely won't come out until middle to late summer, unfortunately. But I'm happy with the way that SketchUp allowed me to iterate on a few different design ideas and play with the dimensions, because I took the dimensions from SketchUp itself and built my cut list coming from the software. It also helped me get a better understanding of relative proportions and space for the workshop that I have and how big of a footprint it would leave, as well as identify any clearance issues with moving tools and stuff around the OneFinity itself. So SketchUp has been a really nice addition for the design work that I've been doing. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't done so already. That's going to be it for part 1 of this video. If you like this content, please give me a like and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. I look forward to seeing you on the next one.